Should you always pull your units as wide as possible, or is there a reason to use a bit of a deeper formation, maybe even a square formation? Is there a reason to ever use a thin phallus-like formation? Well, generally stretching your unit as wide as possible is the way to go. The main reason for this is because it makes the unit wider, which across your entire army makes your entire army wider, and that makes you more difficult to flank. If your army is very wide, the enemy has a long way to travel to get around behind you and to flank you. It'll also help your chances of flanking the enemy. You can make your army even wider as well by putting spaces between the units, which can be handy if the enemy army seems to be much wider than yours. Although this does come with the risk that you're leaving gaps between your line, which units may run through, sneak through, single entities, lords, heroes might sneak through there and get into your back line and cause some problems, so it's not without risk. So as you can imagine, if you put all of your units in more of a square formation, you are going to end up with a very narrow front line or army overall. So if the core of your army isn't that wide, you might be fine with the help of the cavalry, but once the cavalry goes off and does its own thing to engage the flankers or to try and flank the enemy, you may find they have a much wider front line than you, and that will make it very easy for them to flank and envelop you, and obviously that's not what you want. So generally, that's why we're pulling our units as wide as possible, but there is a bit more to unpack here. Here we've got some fully stretched out armored Cossars engaging with Saurus warriors, and they engage the fight at about 1 minute 40. The thing about stretched out units is that because the first row of men is wider, more are getting involved straight away. So that means more damage being done, but also more damage being taken. That typically means that fights will be over sooner. Note here, this fight coming to an end around 4 minutes 10, it started at 1:40, so that's about 2 minutes 30 it took our armored Cossars to beat the Saurus. Now if we do the same fight again but in a square-like formation, starting the fight around 1:30, we'll find that the fight will last much longer because there's less men up front, less men available to fight. Damage output will be slower on both sides, so our unit won't take damage as quickly as it would all spread out, but it won't do damage as quickly either. Although in this example, we are being flanked a little bit on the edge units, but if you could avoid that, all units are going to fight for much longer. And how long does it take this fight to come to an end? Well, we started at 1:30, ending at about 6 minutes 10, so that makes it about 4 minutes 40 to get this fight finished. So that's nearly twice as long as the 2:30 of the wide spread out units. So the advantage here is that you can make fights last longer if you should want to. And there's a few ways this could be advantageous. Perhaps you're a faction that likes prolonged fights, like the Dwarfs or Nurgle. The longer it lasts, the better it is for you. Maybe you've got a big flanking plan with cavalry and you want to buy more time for them to hammer and anvil the crap out of the enemy front line. Or maybe you've got a choke point you want to hold, which could be done by just 2 units. They're wide enough, but no doubt 4 is going to hold much better because less men are fighting, the unit will last longer, although arguably you could just put 2 rows of stretched out units. But either way, this could be handy for buying time, especially useful if you're waiting for reinforcements as well, if you want to minimize damage done to your main army while you wait for reinforcements. So that's one advantage of a deeper formation. Another advantage is that the unit kind of becomes a big solid block of mass, and that can make it much harder for heavier enemy units to pull through and get after whatever is on the other side of your line. As you can see here, this widely spread unit is getting bonked around all over the place by the Kroxigors, and now they're able to just push through the unit like they're not even there, which if you've got missiles and artillery you're trying to protect is obviously going to be pretty bad. Whereas if your unit is much deeper, much more dense, it's harder for these units to push through in that same way, and it will take them longer to do so, and they'll likely take a lot of damage in the process. So if you've got some thick chunky boys coming your way, it could be wise to fatten your unit up. Fighting the ogres springs to mind in this situation, as you will be facing a lot of large that could easily push through your units. You might need to bring more frontline infantry than you normally would to make up for that lack of width of the units, so you'll need more units to make up the width, if that makes sense. But this is going to be a much better way to protect your backline missiles and artillery if you are facing a lot of large coming at you from the front. Against most factions though, you'll probably want to use this more situationally. As you can see here, all my halberd and spear units are stretched out as wide as possible. But when I see cavalry and chariots moving around my flank, well, this is the time to thicken the unit up and make it that big dense ball of mass, so those chariots and cavalry can't go through us and get after all my missiles. And this is especially important against chariots because they do want to go through units and come out the other side so they can keep moving, but if we put our unit in a nice deep formation, they pretty much can't pull through it because that mass of the unit is just too much, so they'll get stuck, they'll take some damage, and they'll need to turn around to get away. So you can change the formation of your unit depending on the situation that's coming your way. Sometimes it might be better to be wide, sometimes it might be better to be a square. So that's a couple of advantages for the melee side of things, but what about the missile side of things? Is it better to have your units all stretched out, or in a square? Well, there is actually a pretty big advantage to the square formation in the time it takes them to turn and start firing. As you can see here, I've given the turn order at the same time, and the unit that's in a square is ready to go already, while the other one is still lining up. This is because when you turn a square on the spot, it doesn't move the men to a new position of where they should move to, it just makes them find the new spot that's closest to them, and that makes it very quick. Whereas when you turn a wide unit, all the men have to reposition to a new spot that's probably a fair ways away from where they were before. Thus, it takes them a few seconds longer to line up and get ready to fire. So there's a small advantage to having missile units in a square, as they'll be able to turn faster, which could mean more DPS in a shorter space of time. There's also less chance they'll turn and touch some enemy units they didn't mean to and end up in a melee fight. But do heed this warning: when you put units in a square formation, they can end up kinda circular, right? And you know what else in this game really likes when things are very circular? Magic. When a unit is widely spread, it's very difficult for a lot of spells to hit the entire unit. At least some men will be safe. Whereas when they're in a square, as you can see, this Pit of Shades will hit the entire unit. So the square formation has more risk of being hit well by magic spells. Whereas the widely spread unit, at least some of the men are safe, so a little bit less damage taken. Or if your units are all together in one big wall like I did earlier with these Black Orcs, well, this is a prime spot for a nice wind spell to tear through all 4 of these units, maybe a breath spell as well. But even vortexes, bombardments, explosion spells, they're all going to have a field day with this kind of thing too. That's of course assuming that the AI pulls it off correctly, which it probably won't. It's pretty rubbish at using wind spells in the right direction, but it is pretty good at landing bombardments, vortexes, explosions, so you gotta be aware of the risk. I also did a little test against cannons to see which kind of formation was safer from cannonballs, and as you can probably guess, the deeper formation took way more damage than the widely spread one, because those cannonballs will tear through pretty much every row of that deeply spread unit, thus doing more damage per shot. I also did the same kind of test against mortars, thinking that the deep formation would be worse here too, but it was actually kind of even. I did this test twice and a different unit routed first each time, so didn't seem to make much of a difference against explosive type of artilleries. I also did the same thing versus crossbows, again thinking that the deeper unit will probably take more damage being more densely packed and an easier target for the missiles, but by the time the crossbows ran out of ammo, it was about the same damage that they'd both taken, although weirdly, the deeper formation unit had lost more men. It was down to 50 men, while the widely spread unit still had about 65 men. So seemingly a slight advantage to being widely spread when being shot at by bow weapons. I also tried the same thing against handgunners, another low trajectory bullet type unit, and I did find the square formation took more damage in this situation, but not by much. So again, a slight bonus to being widely spread when being shot at. So as we can see, some advantages and disadvantages to both ways of using your unit, whether widely spread or more boxed up in a square. The widely spread formation will give you that extra width to help protect you from flanking. It's also seemingly at less risk from missiles, artillery, and magic. It does make the fight go a bit quicker, but that's not really an advantage or disadvantage. But it can be pushed through easily by heavy units, monsters, chariots, etc. And for missile units, it makes them a little bit slower at turning. And pretty much all the opposite for the square formation. You are a big ball of mass, so you're harder to pull through. You'll engage less men in the fight, so you can make the fight last longer. You'll also turn a bit quicker for those missile units. However, you are a very narrow unit, thus you're easier to flank. And you're at more risk of damage from missiles, artillery, and most dangerously, magic. As for spreading your unit really thinly and narrowly, well, I can't really find any use for this unless you want the shortest front line in history. I guess it'll make them fight a long time if they don't get massively flanked, as the AI is just straight up going for here. So perhaps if you've got a particularly narrow choke point, then this kind of formation could be useful. Although there is one place you can make use of a long, thin formation, and that is, of course, the Phallus of Doom. Putting your unit in a really narrow formation so you can sneak it through any gap in the front line for an easy flank in time. And yeah, that's about the only practical way I could think of to use a very narrow formation. But there we go. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. Thanks to all the patrons and YouTube members for supporting this channel. If you want more tactics, I got them right here. Otherwise, I will see you in the future.